Good evening, good afternoon. My name is Sam Fong. So I'm a technology architect for the Microsoft Compliance Platform at Microsoft Canada. I'm in my 12th year now here at Microsoft, really having spent my time across a number of different solution areas, ranging from Office collaboration to cloud adoption to security, and now in compliance, right? So as part of my role and passion, really, I work with a lot of enterprise customers to understand how we can apply technology to support many of their business processes as part of their digital transformation journey, right? Today, we're going to talk about third-party risk, really understanding how that carries, across your data and the data risk. So third-party risk and third-party risk management. I would say this is a challenge that we've had for quite some time as organizations look to achieve better agility through technology partners, consulting firms, independent contractors, service providers, and really the list goes on. I think what's really brought it to the forefront for many executives and board of directors are a few things, right? First, there's the rapid adoption of cloud apps and services that we've seen over the last 5 years, give or take. In a relatively recent 2019 Gartner survey, 71% of organizations said that their third-party network now contains way more vendors than it did 3 years ago. Right? Then we also have new regulations like GDPR that came into effect in 2018. And this really created a cascade of a cascading effect on many new regional and local standards and regulations that's contributed to having now hundreds of daily updates that businesses have to comply with. Right? We're also seeing an increase in the number of supply chain attacks. Bad actors and really cyber criminals are realizing that they can get in way more easily and potentially exploit a much larger target base by moving up that supply chain. In the same 2019 Gartner survey, third-party risk was called out as a top threat by compliance leaders. And a lot of this, sounds new, but really it's something that's been around for a lot longer, right? We simply called it vendor risk management in the past. It's really recently that Gartner and others have started referring to it as third-party risk management, nth-party risk, third-party plus, etc. I would say historically, and certainly, around 2010, when I got more involved in the space, third-party risk management has often been a procurement function and responsibility, right? Procurement would come in, they would identify the cost savings, they would negotiate the price of those contracts, and then legal gets engaged to help draft up and review and determine the terms and conditions for each of the individual vendor contracts. So why is this so important? Why do we hear so much about it now? I think a large part of it has to do with the interconnectedness of many businesses today, right? That dependency that we've put on outsourcing, on all third-party services, whether those are apps, cloud services, or even just in consulting services alone, right? A lot of those dependencies have weaved into becoming a critical aspect of how many businesses operate and function. So if you have an under-managed third-party risk management program, that can lead to a lot of blind spots for your organization. And depending on the critical nature of how those third parties are integrated into the various aspects of your business, this can carry some very serious and significant impact or hinder the business in one of these six risk categories, right? Strategic risk in terms of where you want to go as an enterprise, reputational risk, compliance risk, information security risk, operational risk, and transaction risk. And with probably reputational, operational, compliance, and InfoSec being the ones that you're going to hear about the most, because they tend to be the ones that hit the news that we all read about and hear about. In some of these cases, there's some serious penalties because of the large fines associated with the regulatory violations or client compensation programs, or in some cases where you have to pay for both, right? The ongoing pandemic that we're experiencing as well has put a lot of pressure on businesses having an effective third-party risk management program, right? With those cyber attacks taking place more frequently in this new world of work, right? Where we're all working remotely and juggling between, work and personal commitments. we've definitely seen an increase in the number of supply chain breaches, right? This is causing a ton of disruption. And many businesses are finding themselves, as well as their critical data, exposed and underprepared in their response plans. Regulators are also seeing this, right? So they're applying more pressure on organizations to better manage these risks. We're seeing more and more explicit control requirements being mandated in regulations such as those under the NYDFS, right? The New York Rules and Regulations for Financial Services, and that I'll talk about in a little bit more. The other area is economic volatility and geopolitical risks, right? A lot of businesses are operating with tighter margins. There are possible potential political sanctions that can lead to supplier disruption, maybe even foreign acquisitions for a supplier that you maybe have a relationship with today, right? And in some of those cases with some of the smaller third parties, dealing with possible closure, because again, they're also working with tighter margins and more pressure as well because of everything that's going on. So in my role as a technology architect, I often work with customers on where technology can play a role or help as part of their third-party risk management framework, and what tools we can bring in to help either streamline or accelerate their overall risk assessment or management processes. Quick reminder that I do work for Microsoft, so I'm going to be using some Microsoft solution examples today, but certainly the ideas are generally vendor agnostic, and I'm not planning to go into details of how one vendor versus another here tonight. It's really more about the concepts and how technology can come in to help support a lot of these processes related to third-party risk management. Right? So in many of my conversations, several areas consistently come up again and again. One area is really about getting a clear understanding of the regulatory obligations that your organization must comply with, right? How those carry over to your third parties, what you may be required to do as part of your assessment of those third parties that you're working with or have a relationship with, right? And this includes staying up to date with the hundreds of updates, when those changes happen, checking in with your third parties to also make sure that they're also compliant and up to date with those changes. For many companies that are running small and lean teams, I see this being done today across a half dozen spreadsheets, sometimes more if you're in a highly regulated industry, right? This is a very arduous task, it's very time consuming, and definitely an area where technology can help your team scale. Okay? I'm going to use a Microsoft Compliance Manager example here, but there's certainly a number of other solutions on the marketplace today, such as RSA Archer, as well as OneTrust, right? They're also working in this area, helping us to try to solve some of these challenges. The key is being able to, for these tools, is being able to easily review and track the assessments, right? Understand what I need to do as an organization, what are all the controls and control families that I need to adhere to, right? Here I'm going to use NYDFS as an example, right? This is Title 23 of the New York Code of Rules and Regulations covering financial services, right? Specifically, Part 500 that covers the set of cybersecurity requirements, right? Commonly referred to as NYDFS. It took effect in 2017 and basically applies to any businesses in the New York financial sector or any organizations that are engaged in business with any of those financial services entity, right? So that pretty much covers everybody in New York. Right? I think for us in Canada, there are also implications as well, because this also extends to cover anyone that's doing business with one of those entities in New York. So we become that third party to those organizations. I think this is a really great example of increasing pressure from regulators, right? Within NYDFS, they explicitly stipulate some very specific requirements around cyber, around data protection, as well as third-party service providers, such as the need to have a cybersecurity program, right? The need to have defined policies and procedures. You need to designate someone who's accountable, such as a chief information security officer. You need to have the resources and staff to implement and maintain these controls. You also need to have an incident response plan and the ability to notify, and as well as a commitment to notify any impacted parties within 72 hours. In this case, the regulation NYDFS gets very specific as well for things like multi-factor authentication, application security, information protection of non-public data, as well as third-party service providers, right? So, using a tool like this, there's certainly a number of benefits, right? I mean, just being able to get away from working across spreadsheets, being able to search, filter, and double click into control details, right? And the control families is already really, for me, really amazing. Because, again, I see a lot of customers who do this across spreadsheets. There's a lot of manual and time-consuming tasks just to stay up to date and make sure that we have all the right controls in place. But more and more, what I'm seeing with vendors in this area is they're all trying to help with a lot of complexity with mapping these requirements to different types of controls that they need to actually implement in what I call improvement actions, right? This kind of helps you understand, okay, here are the things I need to do. Here are the things that's going to extend over to my third parties. And then figure out, how do I prioritize those, right? And a lot of them will take a gamification approach, right? Or an impact to a compliance score, which also takes into account and takes advantage of a shared control mapping. What this is, and for anyone that has to comply with multiple standards will know this pain really, really well. Right? You start with one regulation, take NYDFS, and you've got just under 50 requirements, right? You add another regulation you have to comply with, FedRAMP moderate, and all of a sudden you're up another 800 requirements. So you can imagine how that list grows exponentially if you have more than 1, 2, or 3 regulations you have to stay on top of in order to understand, hey, how does that impact my business? How does it impact all my third-party relationships? So what this shared control mapping does is really highlight where an implemented control will help you satisfy multiple requirements across multiple regulations, right? So it's really saving you a lot of time and effort from having to track each of these one by one. Another area that I'm seeing a lot of investment in terms of tools to help with compliance management is continuous monitoring. Right? Today, we go through regular audit cycles. The frequency of that is often dictated by the level of risk as part of your management framework. Other times, it's also dictated by the regulations themselves, right? In terms of how often you have to do those audits, annually, biannually. This takes a lot of effort. And what happens then in between those audit cycles, right? Who's keeping an eye on all of your controls, making sure everything is working 24/7, 365 days a year? Right? So that's where a lot of these vendors in the space, we're all trying to figure out and find ways to solve for this, right? We're looking for ways to at least hook into the technical controls so we can automate that continuous testing, right? And monitoring in near real time. And if something goes out of compliance, we want to be able to alert the organization and really let the governance committees be aware of something's gone wrong and we need to address it right away rather than waiting until we go through an audit and realize we failed and the auditors come and tell us you got to fix all these things. So this is all really great, right? Great, it helps me understand what I need to do to keep my organization compliant, right? But can this also be extended to help me manage and assess my third-party risks? The answer is yes, to some degree. Let's take a look at, I'll use the NYDFS DFS example requirement for secure disposal and retention. Right? Data lineage is a key risk, and this is something that's going to apply to your third-party service providers if they're acting either as a data processor or a data custodian or both, because we really need to know where else our data is going, right? Or who may also have access to it. What controls do those third parties have in place as safeguards? At the very minimum, when I go into that requirement, the requirement details, knowing about the recommended actions that I need to take in order to satisfy this requirement helps contribute towards my vendor risk questionnaire, right? Knowing what questions to ask my third parties to say, hey, do you have these controls in place? Because that risk that requirement that I need to adhere to extends out to the services that these third parties are providing me. Right? A little bit of tidbit about me. I was part of the original team that helped establish BPOS, or what is now Office 365 in the Canadian marketplace. And in the really early days, I would get at least several of these questionnaires a week to fill out. Right? Oftentimes I have to go back to engineering and get the latest SOC report, the SSAE attestations. And a lot of times, those don't even give me the answers that my customers are looking for. But thankfully, we've gotten a lot more efficient in doing this, right? Now we share this level of detail directly with customers. So as a customer, right, and this is something important to look for when you're working with your third parties with other cloud service providers, is whether they provide this in the central locations, because that's really going to help you accelerate a lot of your assessments, getting the information that you need. In this example, right, I can go in and directly see whether they've implemented the relevant controls, and any of the implementation notes. Specifically in this example, even calls out data retention and disposition controls that they've enforced and applied to their third parties, right? Which becomes, if I'm the customer, it becomes my fourth party or potentially fifth party risk that I need to be aware of. It even goes further into the testing details of these controls, right? Test notes, supporting documentation, right? So again, depending on the third party that you're assessing, there may already be a lot of information available. That's going to save you a lot of time from having to request each one from each of your third parties. Okay? So that's a little bit about technology that's out there to help you understand the regulatory obligations, mapping them up to controls, and then using them as inputs into your third-party risk assessment questionnaires. Another key step is taking inventory of your third-party landscape, right? And performing risk assessments for each of the vendors across a number of areas, such as business continuity plan, geopolitical risk, and very much related to third-party compliance, the set of cyber and audit risk factors that each one complies with. To help you in these risk assessments, and really what you want to do where it's possible is work or look for an assessment tool that provides security risk scoring, right? Having that in a central place, because what that does is gives you up-to-date insight into the risk of your third-party vendors, right? And again, that's going to, a lot of these security score tools is going to, save you a tremendous amount of time. You don't need to interview and research each vendor separately. Usually there's a single portal you go into and you can collect and see a lot of this information. So I'm going to be showing an example from Microsoft Cloud App Security, right? But again, that's a reminder that I work for Microsoft. In terms of the marketplace, there are a lot of other vendors such as McAfee Envision, Netscope that all have similar capabilities in helping towards these processes. For cloud service providers, right, this has really become a lot easier because of just the format of what they offer, right? A lot of these are standardized services. So this is where you want to take advantage of the vast team of analysts and as well as automated data extraction that these security score vendors provide, right? Who are continuously monitoring, they're reviewing for updates to the risk posture of many different service providers, different third-party providers that you're going to work with. And oftentimes you can even fine-tune that risk scoring model for your organizational risk threshold, depending on, again, what industry or geography you're in. Typically, the security score vendors, they'll evaluate risks, all right, across a number of different attributes over a number of different areas, such as general background of the company, right? For example, like a third party that you're working with that's based in Eastern Europe, who's only been around for a couple of years, is going to be in a very different risk category than one that's been around for decades, operating out of Germany, where there's much more stringent regulatory requirements, right? You're also going to get insight into what kind of cyber controls and compliance certifications that they may have implemented or been audited against, right? Controls such as, do they support multi-factor authentication, right? Remember going back to, NYDFS, right? There are stipulations around, specifically around MFA, and some of that carries over what are your third parties doing. If a vendor doesn't do or support MFA, right? Do they integrate via SAML, right? So you can layer on your own user access control policies as part of your zero trust framework. Will help answer questions like what kind of data at rest encryption, data in transit encryptions do they use, as well as what is their data retention policy, both while you're an active subscriber, but also after termination, right? What are the controls that have in place to make sure that they dispose of your data that you have with them while you had an active relationship with these third parties. And when it comes to data risk and data lineage, it's really not just about your third parties anymore, right? More and more so, regulators are looking into this, they're enforcing this. A lot of regulations now hold the covered entity responsible for nth party or third party plus risks and data breaches, right? And when you look across the marketplace today, a lot of these apps and services are offering integration points into their stack. So you want to look for, and a lot of these tools coming out now also have this monitoring capability, which is being able to monitor what the fourth parties are doing, right? Who has requested access and gotten access to that data. In this example, OAuth integration is a really good example of when this happens, right? You've probably seen the permission prompts in the consumer space asking for access to your Facebook profiles, to your Google profiles. Well, the same thing happens in the enterprise, right? Except these fourth parties are requesting and getting access to your cloud data and possibly your customer data, right? So really you want to find something or take advantage of these tools that help you get visibility into that type of activity, be able to monitor on an ongoing basis, and even quite possibly block any of the activities that exceed your risk threshold. Last, but certainly not least, is we need to understand what data is being accessed, right? Where is it being processed? How is it being stored by these third parties, right? What volumes are we actually seeing in production use? Does the type of data correspond with what's defined in the contractual terms, right? It's not uncommon that we'll negotiate a contract for a project. It deploys, rolls out very successfully. The platform that is built on gets really popular. And now we're putting more and more critical data into it without necessarily going back and revisiting the terms and conditions or even the set of established controls. Right? So here I'm using Azure Purview and Microsoft Information as examples, but you want to look, there are tools in the marketplace again that give you a way to go out and classify and map out your data across these third parties, right? There's a lot of different solutions that do this in different ways, right? The other ones that come up a lot are vendors like Informatica or Titus. The key is being able to map out the set of third-party data custodians that are storing your business critical data, right? Being able to understand and classify it using a consistent, unified set of classification definitions, and be able to get an understanding of the volume and the type of data that's there. Because if a data breach does occur for that third party, you want to have an accurate insight into any potential impact to you as an organization, right? Based on what classification of data is actually held with that third party, not just what's defined in the contracts and terms during the initial onboarding phase, because sometimes and often that could change and does, right? And so you want to know when these things happen, what do I actually have? What's my exposure look like? And ideally, you'll also have a set of governance policies implemented against this data set, right? That way you're minimizing your exposure risk, right? An attack service in the event of a breach, right? Because you've got the right policies in place, you're disposing of data that you no longer need. Some of this is also important, right? It's also required under regulations like GDPR, the Freedom of Information Act, and the right to be forgotten, right? So it's just good practice to do. Finally, oftentimes, once that data is mapped and classified, it also makes it easier for us to track who's accessing it and what's being done to this data, right? And so this gets into more the tactical side of implementing some of the cyber security controls, allowing us to enforce item level protection or encryption policies, as well as loss prevention policies to further safeguard that data. A lot of which, outside of being stored in, with third-party custodians, may be accessed by other third parties, right? You may have contractors and consulting firms that are all working with this data on your behalf on a day-to-day basis. So in closing, hopefully I was able to share with you some new insights into some technology innovations that kind of help or can help support your third-party risk assessment processes and programs, particularly around understanding your regulatory obligations, how that may extend out to your third parties, accelerating that risk assessment process for each of those third parties, and then also streamlining the classification of your data, right, across these third-party custodians. So I'm going to pause there. I'm going to stop there. Thank you again to Brian and the CyberTech risk community for this opportunity, for the speaking opportunity. I look forward to learning more from this group and also from my peers later on in the panel discussion. So back to you, Brian.